The fluorescent lights of Franklin Middle School cast a soft glow across Sarah Williams's classroom as she gathered her belongings. The clock read 7:45 p.m., another late evening spent helping students who needed extra attention. Her dedicated after-school tutoring sessions had become legendary among parents and faculty alike, though she never sought recognition for these additional hours. Tonight's session had been particularly rewarding. Marcus, a struggling 8th grader, finally grasped the concept of algebraic equations after weeks of patient guidance. The look of pure joy on his face when he solved a problem independently made all the extra hours worthwhile. Sarah carefully tucked his practice sheets into her folder, planning to display them on her wall of victories tomorrow. As she walked through the empty hallways, her heels echoing against the freshly waxed floors, Sarah reflected on her decade of teaching. Every wall held memories. Student artwork, science fair certificates, and photographs from graduation ceremonies. Her colleagues often asked why she chose to teach in this underfunded district when private schools regularly tried to recruit her. But Sarah knew exactly why. These were the students who needed her most. The crisp autumn air greeted her as she stepped into the parking lot. Her silver Honda Civic sat alone under a flickering lamppost, covered in fallen maple leaves. Sarah brushed them aside, remembering how her father had taught her to always keep her car pristine. A well-maintained vehicle is a safe vehicle, he'd say. Just last week, she'd spent her Saturday morning at Johnson's auto shop for a complete maintenance check, wanting to ensure everything was perfect before the winter months arrived. The drive home started peacefully enough. Sarah hummed along to Ella Fitzgerald, her go-to music after long days. The streets were quiet, with only occasional cars passing by. She was looking forward to grading papers in her comfortable armchair, perhaps with a cup of chamomile tea and her cat, Luna, purring beside her. At the intersection of Maple and 5th, Sarah noticed the pride she felt in her neighborhood. Despite its challenges, the community maintained its character through small businesses, community gardens, and neighbors who looked out for each other. The local bookstore owner, Mrs. Chen, still saved the latest educational books for her. And Mr. Washington at the diner always had her favorite peach cobbler ready on Friday afternoons. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror startled her from these pleasant thoughts. Sarah checked her speed, 32 in a 35 zone. Her turn signals were working. She'd used them at the last 3 turns. Her registration was current, insurance up to date, and driver's license readily accessible in her wallet. Years of her parents' careful instruction had ingrained these habits. Pulling over smoothly, Sarah positioned her car safely against the curb, turned off her music, and placed both hands visible on the steering wheel. Another lesson from her father, a retired postal worker who'd experienced his share of traffic stops. The police cruiser parked behind her, its lights painting the street in alternating colors. Her heart raced despite her calm exterior. Through her side mirror, Sarah watched the officer approach, his flashlight beam sweeping across her license plate. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was an educated professional who had done nothing wrong. The registration papers in her glove compartment were organized chronologically. Her natural teaching instincts applied to every aspect of her life. The tap on her window came sharper than expected. As Sarah pressed the button to lower it, she noticed her hand trembling slightly. She steadied it by thinking of Marcus's triumphant smile earlier that evening. Whatever this was about, she would handle it with the same patience and dignity she brought to her classroom every day. License and registration, the officer demanded, his flashlight beam uncomfortably bright in Sarah's eyes. She maintained her composure, reaching slowly for her documents while narrating her movements. "I'm getting my license from my wallet and the registration from the glove compartment, officer," she said clearly, remembering her role as a model for her students even in difficult moments. The registration papers slipped smoothly from their folder. Each maintenance record, insurance document, and inspection report organized by date. Sarah had spent years teaching her students the importance of organization, and she lived by those same principles. She handed everything to the officer with steady hands, though her heart continued its rapid rhythm. "Do you know why I pulled you over, Mom?" the officer asked, scanning her documentation with unusual intensity. His nameplate read Officer Barrett, and Sarah noticed he couldn't be much older than some of her former students now in college. "No, sir, I don't," Sarah replied honestly. "I was driving within the speed limit and following all traffic rules." She thought of the defensive driving course she'd completed just last summer. Another example she'd used to show her students how continuous learning extended beyond the classroom. Officer Barrett's expression remained stern. "Your brake light is out." The statement hung in the air like an accusation rather than a notification. Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. She distinctly remembered Jerry at Johnson's auto shop testing all her lights during last week's maintenance check. "There must be some mistake," Sarah explained professionally, the same tone she used during parent-teacher conferences. "I had my car fully inspected last week at Johnson's auto shop on Main Street. They checked all the lights, and everything was functioning properly. I have the receipt right here." She reached for her organizer, where she kept all vehicle-related documents. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Officer Barrett interrupted, his tone shifting. Sarah's hand froze midway to her organizer, her teacher's intuition sensing the situation spiraling beyond a simple traffic stop. The cool evening air hit her face as she carefully exited her car, her sensible work heels clicking against the pavement. Other vehicles passed slowly, their drivers' curious glances adding to her discomfort. Sarah thought of her students passing by. What lesson would they take from seeing their teacher in this position? "Walk with me to the rear of your vehicle," Officer Barrett instructed. Sarah complied, maintaining her dignity with each step. The red and blue lights continued their rhythmic dance across the surrounding buildings, creating shadows that seemed to whisper judgment. To her astonishment, all lights on her car worked perfectly, brake lights included. She watched as Officer Barrett tested them multiple times, his frown deepening with each illumination. Rather than acknowledge the error, he began questioning her about her destination, her occupation, and her vehicle ownership. "I'm returning home from Franklin Middle School," Sarah explained patiently, drawing strength from thoughts of her classroom. "I stayed late tutoring students who needed extra help with algebra. I've been teaching there for 10 years. She reached for her school ID, hoping to validate her words. "That's an expensive car for a teacher," Officer Barrett remarked, ignoring her ID. Sarah felt her chest tighten at the implication, but her voice remained steady. She purchased her Honda Civic with savings from years of careful budgeting and summer school teaching, another lesson in financial responsibility she shared with her students. The situation escalated as Officer Barrett began writing not one, but multiple citations. Sarah watched in dismay as he listed violations she knew were unfounded: broken brake light, failure to provide proper documentation, and most shockingly, disorderly conduct. Each scratch of his pen against the citation pad echoed like chalk on a blackboard, writing a lesson in injustice she never wanted to teach. The kitchen table in Sarah's modest apartment disappeared beneath stacks of legal documents and printouts. Her usual lesson plans and student assignments had been temporarily replaced by courthouse procedures and traffic regulations. Luna, her gray tabby cat, watched curiously from the windowsill as Sarah highlighted another relevant passage in the state traffic code. It was nearly midnight, but sleep felt less important than preparation. Sarah had always taught her students that knowledge was power, and now she was living that lesson. Her laptop screen glowed with tabs of legal resources, while her printer hummed steadily, producing copies of her car maintenance records and teaching credentials. "If my students can master algebra, I can understand these laws," Sarah whispered to herself, a habit formed from years of positive self-talk in challenging classroom moments. She'd spent the past week studying similar cases, learning legal terminology, and practicing her testimony in front of her bathroom mirror. The dashcam footage from the convenience store across from the traffic stop had been surprisingly easy to obtain. Mr. Patel, the store owner whose daughter was in Sarah's class last year, had readily agreed to help. The video clearly showed her brake lights functioning perfectly that evening, a small victory that gave her hope. Sarah reached for her phone, scrolling through messages of support from her colleagues. Ms. Rodriguez from the science department had offered to cover her morning classes if the court proceedings ran long. Principal Johnson had written a glowing character reference letter, emphasizing her dedication to education and spotless professional record. Her father's advice echoed in her mind. Always fight with facts, never with anger. She'd taken those words to heart, methodically building her case like she would structure a lesson plan. Each piece of evidence was carefully labeled and organized in her presentation folder, blue, because she'd read that color inspired trust and confidence. The wall calendar caught her attention, the court date circled in red. Just 3 days away. Sarah stood up to stretch, her muscles stiff from hours of research. Walking to her classroom bulletin board, she smiled at the recent addition, a handmade card from her students. They'd noticed her staying late to prepare her case and had responded with their own show of support. "Ms. Williams, you taught us to stand up for what's right," one student had written. Another drew a picture of her as Wonder Woman, complete with a teacher's pointer instead of a golden lasso. Their faith in her reinforced her determination to see this through. Returning to her work, Sarah began practicing her statement again. Her voice grew stronger with each rehearsal, the initial tremor of uncertainty replaced by quiet confidence. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was standing up for every person who'd ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. A text message buzzed on her phone. It was from Marcus's mother, offering to attend the hearing as a character witness. Sarah felt tears welling up, but quickly blinked them away. Emotion had its place, but now was the time for focus and preparation. Opening her planner, Sarah made a final checklist for court day. Wear her professional blue suit, arrive an hour early, bring 3 copies of all documents. Remember to speak clearly and maintain eye contact. Simple steps, just like the ones she wrote on her classroom board every morning. As midnight passed, Sarah finally allowed herself to rest. Tomorrow would bring another day of preparation, but she felt ready. The same dedication she brought to teaching would now serve her in the courtroom. Before turning off her desk lamp, she wrote one final note in her planner. Truth, like knowledge, shines brightest when tested. Dawn painted the courthouse steps in shades of amber as Sarah arrived, precisely 60 minutes before her scheduled hearing. Her lucky blue suit, freshly pressed the night before, gave her an air of quiet professionalism. The parking meter read 7:15 a.m., early enough to gather her thoughts before facing Judge Henderson. The century-old building loomed before her, its marble columns reaching skyward like silent sentinels. Sarah paused at the entrance, remembering all the field trips she'd led here, teaching students about civic responsibility and justice. Now she was living those lessons in an unexpected way. Inside, the morning security check moved efficiently. The guard, an older gentleman with kind eyes, noticed her teacher's ID as she placed her bag on the scanner. "My granddaughter had you last year for 8th grade," he shared with a warm smile. "She still talks about your history projects." This small connection eased some of Sarah's tension as she collected her belongings. The polished wooden benches in courtroom 3 were still empty when she entered. Sarah chose a seat in the second row, close enough to hear clearly but not so close as to appear eager. She watched the morning light filter through tall windows, casting geometric patterns across the floor. The kind of natural mathematics she'd point out to her students. Other people began filtering in. Lawyers in sharp suits, court officers arranging papers, defendants with worried expressions. Sarah pulled out her carefully prepared folder, double-checking each document one final time. The maintenance receipts, character references, and dashcam footage were arranged in perfect order, just like her lesson materials. At 8:15, the bailiff entered to prepare the courtroom. Sarah observed his routine with the same attention she gave to understanding her students' learning patterns. He straightened the flags, tested the microphones, and arranged the judge's bench with practiced precision. Her attention shifted to the large portrait behind the judge's chair. Lady Justice, blindfolded and holding her scales. Sarah had often explained this symbol to her students, emphasizing how justice should be blind to everything except truth. The irony of this moment wasn't lost on her. The growing murmur of voices drew her attention back to the present. The courtroom had filled considerably, including, to her surprise, several familiar faces. Ms. Rodriguez sat nearby, offering an encouraging nod. Behind her, Mr. Paddle from the convenience store had come with the dashcam footage, and Marcus's mother arrived wearing her nurse's scrubs, clearly between shifts. At 8:45, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Michael Henderson presiding. The room rustled with movement as everyone stood. Sarah straightened her spine, channeling the same presence she used to command attention in her classroom. Judge Henderson entered, his black robes flowing behind him. His reputation for strict sentencing preceded him, but Sarah refused to let that intimidate her. She'd faced challenging parent conferences and difficult administrative meetings. This was just another moment requiring grace under pressure. As the initial proceedings began, Sarah noticed the judge's interactions with various cases before hers. His tone shifted subtly between defendants, his attention varying noticeably. She documented these observations mentally, just as she would note student interactions in her classroom. Finally, at 9:30, the bailiff called her name. Case number 47,293, Sarah Williams. She rose smoothly, gathering her materials with steady hands. The weight of her student's support card in her folder reminded her of why this moment mattered, not just for her, but for every lesson about fairness and courage she'd ever taught. Walking to the defendant's table, Sarah felt the eyes of the courtroom upon her, but rather than wilt under their gaze, she drew strength from it. After all, she'd spent years teaching students to stand tall in challenging moments. Now was her time to lead by example. Sarah stood before Judge Henderson's bench, her presentation folder open to the first document. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reminiscent of her classroom during early morning lessons. She had just begun explaining her car's recent maintenance record when the judge's gavel interrupted her. "Ms. Williams," Judge Henderson peered over his reading glasses, "we have a full docket today. Please keep to the relevant facts." His tone carried the same dismissiveness she'd sometimes heard from administrators who underestimated her students' potential. Rather than deflate her, it strengthened her resolve. "Your Honor," Sarah responded, her voice carrying the same clear confidence she used to engage struggling students. "The maintenance record is relevant because it proves my brake lights were fully functional just 3 days before the traffic stop." She gestured to Mr. Patel in the gallery, who held the dashcam footage envelope. "I have video evidence to support this." The judge's lips tightened. Officer Barrett's report clearly states, "If I may, Your Honor," Sarah continued respectfully but firmly, the way she'd redirect an off-track class discussion. "The video evidence directly contradicts the officer's report. Additionally, I have character witnesses present who can speak to my reputation for honesty and attention to detail." Ms. Rodriguez nodded from her seat, her presence reminding Sarah of their shared commitment to truth and fairness. Marcus's mother, still in her hospital scrubs, sat straight-backed and attentive, embodying the support of her school community. "Ms. Williams, this court relies on the sworn testimony of its officers," Judge Henderson stated, shuffling papers without looking at her evidence. "Your teaching credentials, while admirable, have no bearing on this traffic violation." Sarah felt a familiar spark, the same one that ignited when someone underestimated her students. "Your Honor, my profession is relevant because it speaks to both my character and my financial situation. A $2,500 fine would significantly impact my ability to provide essential classroom supplies for my students." She opened her gray book, transformed now into a monthly budget ledger. "I've documented how this fine would affect not only me but the educational resources available to 32 middle school students." The judge's gavel crashed down again. "Ms. Williams, this court is not concerned with your classroom budget." Sarah stood taller, channeling every moment she'd advocated for her students. "Your Honor, justice should consider context. These citations arose from a traffic stop where no violation existed. I've provided evidence that my brake lights were working, documentation of recent maintenance, and witnesses to my character. Ms. Williams, Judge Henderson's voice sharpened, I'm reminding you that arguing with this court could result in contempt charges. The courtroom fell silent. Sarah felt the weight of every lesson she taught about standing up for truth. Behind her, she heard the subtle rustle of movement as her supporters leaned forward, their presence giving her strength. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, I'm not arguing. I'm presenting facts, just as I teach my students to do. In my classroom, we learn that facts matter more than assumptions, and evidence speaks louder than preconceptions. She placed her final document on the submission tray, a letter from Principal Johnson detailing her decade of service to the school. I'm here today not just for myself, but for everyone who believes in the power of truth and the importance of being heard. The judge's expression hardened, but Sarah remained composed. Years of maintaining calm during classroom chaos had prepared her for this moment. She thought of her students learning about civic responsibility and realized that sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the classroom. The courtroom clock ticked heavily as Judge Henderson reviewed the final documents. Sarah stood perfectly still, the way she did when waiting for students to work through challenging problems. Every eye in the room focused on the bench, where justice would soon be measured not in lesson plans, but in dollars. Ms. Williams, Judge Henderson began, removing his reading glasses, while your presentation has been thorough. This court finds the officer's testimony compelling. He paused, shuffling papers with deliberate slowness. The fine stands at $2,500, to be paid within 30 days. Sarah felt her heart skip, but her face remained composed. The same expression she wore when students shared their struggles at home. $2,500. That amount represented her entire emergency fund, carefully built from years of budgeting and summer school teaching. Furthermore, the judge continued, given your persistent questioning of Officer Barrett's authority, an additional $50 in court fees will be applied. His gavel struck the sound block with finality, each echo reminding Sarah of her dwindling savings. In that moment, Sarah thought of her classroom's supply closet. The new books she planned to buy, the art supplies for science projects, the backup calculators for students who couldn't afford their own. All would have to wait. She'd learned long ago that teaching often meant sacrifice, but this felt different. Ms. Rodriguez stepped forward from the gallery, her hand raised in protest, but Sarah subtly shook her head. She taught her students that dignity in difficult moments spoke louder than angry words. Now was her time to demonstrate that lesson. Thank you, Your Honor. Sarah spoke clearly, her teacher's voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. I would like to request a payment plan, given my salary as an educator. She opened her carefully prepared budget document, the pages crisp with determination rather than defeat. Judge Henderson waved his hand dismissively. Submit your request to the clerk. Next case. His attention had already shifted to the next file, Sarah's future financial struggles apparently not worthy of further consideration. As Sarah gathered her documents, she noticed Marcus's mother wiping away tears. But Sarah stood straight, her shoulders back, remembering how she taught her students that setbacks were not endings but beginnings of new chapters. Outside the courtroom, the morning sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the marble floors. Sarah's supporters gathered around her, offering words of encouragement and support. Mr. Patel, still holding his unused dashcam footage, promised to help spread awareness of her story. What will you do about your classroom supplies? Ms. Rodriguez asked softly, knowing how much Sarah spent from her own pocket to support their students. Sarah smiled, the kind of smile she gave students when they struggled but hadn't given up. We'll find a way, she replied, already calculating alternative solutions in her mind. Maybe it's time for that creative funding project we discussed. Walking down the courthouse steps, Sarah noticed a young girl watching her intently. The child reminded her of her students, curious, observant, learning from every adult interaction they witnessed. Sarah straightened her blue suit jacket and nodded confidently to the girl. Even now, especially now, she was teaching by example. In her car, Sarah finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. The fine would drain her savings, but it hadn't touched her spirit. She pulled out her lesson planner, turning to next week's schedule. Between the margins of mathematics and literature, she began writing a new lesson plan, one about resilience, justice, and the importance of standing up for truth, even when the cost seemed too high. News of Sarah's court hearing spread through Franklin Middle School like a lesson in social studies coming alive. During lunch break, teachers gathered in the staff room, their conversations shifting from daily lesson plans to discussions of justice and support. Ms. Rodriguez stood at the whiteboard, the same one usually covered in scientific formulas, now listing ideas for fundraising events. Sarah has given so much to this school, Principal Johnson addressed the gathered staff. It's our turn to stand with her. He glanced at the empty chair where Sarah usually sat during meetings, grading papers while sharing teaching strategies with newer colleagues. The next morning, Sarah arrived to find her classroom transformed. Handmade cards covered her desk, each one expressing support in the unique voice of her students. "Ms. Williams, you taught us that math always has a solution," wrote Marcus, his algebra homework attached to show his continued progress despite her recent distraction. During third period, a knock at her classroom door revealed Mrs. Chen from the local bookstore. "My daughter was in your first class here," she said, holding a box of new educational books. "Consider this an investment in justice." The books would replace the ones Sarah had planned to buy before the fine depleted her savings. Word continued to spread beyond the school walls. Local teachers began sharing their own stories of similar experiences, creating an informal network of support and advocacy. A retired judge, having heard of the case, offered to review the proceedings pro bono, his expertise highlighting patterns that needed addressing. Sarah's students, inspired by their teacher's grace under pressure, organized their own response. The school newspaper, typically focused on cafeteria menus and sports scores, published a powerful editorial about fairness and standing up for what's right. The young writers carefully chose their words, applying the lessons in clear communication that Sarah had taught them. During Friday's bake sale, originally planned to fund new classroom calculators, parents and students alike contributed extra, understanding that supporting their teacher meant supporting education itself. Mr. Washington from the diner sent over his famous peach cobbler, attracting even more community members to the cause. "You've created something powerful here," Ms. Rodriguez told Sarah as they watched students count the day's proceeds. "They're learning more about civic responsibility from your example than any textbook could teach them." Sarah observed her students working together, applying mathematical skills to real-world problems as they calculated totals and made change. Even in this challenging situation, learning continued, taking new forms and deeper meanings. Local education blogs picked up the story, not for its controversy, but for its demonstration of community solidarity. Other schools reached out, sharing resources and offering support. A neighboring district's Teachers Association invited Sarah to speak about her experience, turning a personal setback into an opportunity for broader awareness. In her classroom after hours, Sarah pinned a new message on her wall of victories. Alongside student achievements and academic breakthroughs, she added a simple note: "When we stand together, we all rise higher." Below it, she placed a photo from the bake sale, showing her students working together, their faces bright with purpose. As she prepared the next day's lesson plans, Sarah realized that her greatest teaching moment hadn't happened during regular class hours. It was unfolding now, showing her students and the community that education extended beyond textbooks and tests. It was about standing up for what's right, supporting each other, and finding strength in unity. The setting sun cast long shadows through her classroom windows, but Sarah's spirit felt lighter than it had since the traffic stop. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to demonstrate the power of resilience and community support. Early morning light streamed through Sarah's classroom windows as she reviewed the legal documents on her desk. The appeal papers prepared by attorney Lisa Martinez from the Educational Legal Defense Fund sat beside her morning lesson plans. 2 weeks had passed since the court hearing, but its impact continued to create positive ripples throughout the community. Ms. Williams, Marcus called from the doorway, arriving early as he had every day since the hearing. "I brought today's paper." He placed the local Gazette on her desk, open to an article about educational equity and judicial reform. Sarah's case had become a catalyst for broader discussions about fairness in their community. The appeal process was proceeding differently from the original hearing. Attorney Martinez had been impressed by Sarah's meticulous documentation and the community's response. "Your teaching skills show in how you organized everything," she had remarked during their first meeting. "This isn't just about a traffic fine anymore. It's about ensuring equal treatment for everyone." During her free period, Sarah met with Principal Johnson to discuss a new initiative born from her experience. They were developing a civic education program that would bring legal professionals into classrooms to teach students about their rights and responsibilities. Several judges, not including Judge Henderson, had volunteered to participate. "Your situation opened many eyes," Principal Johnson shared, reviewing the program outline. "Sometimes the best lessons come from our greatest challenges." Sarah thought of how her students had watched her handle adversity, learning more from her actions than any textbook could teach. The financial burden of the fine had been eased by unexpected support. Local educators had organized a professional development workshop where Sarah shared her experience and teaching methods. The honorarium she received matched the amount of the fine, but the real value lay in the connections formed and awareness raised. Mrs. Chen's bookstore now hosted weekly discussion groups about civic engagement, attended by students, parents, and community members. The conversations went beyond Sarah's case to address broader issues of fairness and accountability in their community. Sarah attended when she could, proud to see her students participating in thoughtful discussions about justice. In her classroom, Sarah introduced a new segment to their morning routine. Along with mathematics and literature, students discussed current events and civic responsibility. They learned to analyze situations from multiple perspectives, ask thoughtful questions, and propose constructive solutions, skills that reached far beyond any standardized test requirements. The appeal date was set for next month, but regardless of its outcome, positive changes were already taking root. Other teachers began incorporating civic education into their lessons. The local police department initiated community outreach programs focused on building trust and understanding. Small steps, perhaps, but meaningful ones. As Sarah prepared for afternoon classes, she noticed new additions to her classroom's wall of victories. Alongside academic achievements, students had posted articles about civic engagement, community action, and positive change. Their notes reflected growing awareness. Standing up for justice means standing up for everyone, and every voice matters when truth speaks. The final bell rang, but several students lingered, working on their new community awareness project. Sarah watched them collaborate, seeing future leaders emerging from what could have been merely a disheartening experience. They were learning that advocacy could be peaceful yet powerful. That change often started with one person willing to stand firm. "Ms. Williams," a quiet voice called. It was Jessica, one of her shyest students. "I decided I want to be a lawyer when I grow up. Not just any lawyer, but one who helps teachers and students." Sarah smiled, recognizing how moments of challenge could inspire new dreams and directions. As the afternoon sun painted her classroom in warm hues, Sarah updated her lesson plans for tomorrow. Next to the standard curriculum objectives, she added a new goal: teach students that justice, like education, is a continuous journey of growth, understanding, and positive change.